Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Chapter 1 Read Aloud. Today, it is also a very special edition because I'll be doing a review of the book Paola Santiago and the River of Tears. I was lucky enough to get an advance copy of this book, so it hasn't hit the shelves yet. It will in about a month, so it will this summer. In fact, I have another video highlighting some great summer books coming all this summer of 2020. You can go back and check out, and this is one of those books. So I got a chance to read it. Let me tell you a little bit about the book and I'll give you a brief review before I read chapter 1. Space-obsessed 12-year-old Paola Santiago and her two best friends, Emma and Dante, know the rule: stay away from the river. It's all they've heard since a schoolmate of theirs drowned a year ago. Paola is obsessed to admit that she has been told to stay away for even longer than that because her mother is constantly warning her about La Llorona, the wailing ghost woman who wanders the banks of the Guia at night, looking for young people to drag into its murky depths. Hating her mother's humiliating superstitions and knowing that she and her friends would never venture into the water, Powell organizes a meetup to test out the new telescope near the Guia, since it's the best stargazing spot. But when Emma never arrives and Powell sees a shadowy figure in the reeds, it seems like maybe her mom was right. Powell has always relied on hard science to make sense of the world. But to find her friend, she will have to enter the world of her nightmares, which includes unnatural mist, mind-bending monsters, and relentless spirits controlled by a terrifying force that defies both logic and legend. So this book is published by Rick Riordan Presents. So those of you who are fans of Rick Riordan, he is the author of the Lightning Thief series and many other series. But he also has a publishing house where he publishes books by newer authors that highlight some aspect of a culture. So, for example, he originally wrote about Greek mythology, and he also wrote about Norse mythology. So he highlights these authors. So this one has a little bit of Latino culture in it. So there's a lot of great language. There's a lot of great descriptions, a lot of great culture in it. I enjoyed this book because of the adventure. I love Rick Riordan books to begin with. So the fact that this was part of his publishing house meant that it was going to be an amazing adventure book. I also love that there was a female protagonist. So it wasn't so much a love story because they are younger. They're 11, 12 years old. However, there was a hint of love in it, which was nice to have in a story with adventure. It had some depth to it. But I thought the descriptions of some of the monsters that they found, I'm trying not to give you too many spoilers, but some of the descriptions of the monsters they found were great. Also, one of my favorite parts was all the different tools that she used, and they referenced to somehow into the culture about how they seem kind of like useless in the culture, but in reality, in this other spirit world, they were really useful tools. So again, I enjoyed the plot. I enjoyed the story. It is a series, so that means there's going to be another one. And I kind of looked ahead. It's not going to be published till next summer, but this book is a great first series read. You could technically read this book and be satisfied until next summer. It's not one of those, cliffhangers where you're kind of angry at the author because you want the next book right now. But it is interesting enough that I'd like to see where the story goes. So that was my kind of overview review of it because I don't want to give too many spoilers to it about what happens, who lives, who dies, all of that. Filled with adventure and mystery. So definitely recommend it. But here is chapter 1. It was at 118 degrees in Silver Springs, Arizona, and the Gila River was thick with algae. But Paola was careful to keep that observation to herself. The last time she mentioned algae in front of her best friend Dante, he'd shoved a gummy worm up her nose. Algae was green and slimy. It stuck to your feet when you stepped into the wrong part of the swimming hole. It smelled awful. It made the river look weird and alien when the water got too low. But when processed and extracted and purified, an acre of it could create 10,000 gallons of usable biofuel. And wasn't that awesome enough to make up for its general ickiness? Aware of Dante and other best friend Emma sitting on the picnic blanket on either side of her, Powell decided didn't speak aloud the wonders of algae. Sometimes she thought there were still granules of sour sugar from that gummy worm slowly making their way to her brain through her nasal cavity. There was a lot of candy spread out before them today, and Powell didn't want to find out what other varieties would feel like it in her nostrils. Shuddering, she kept her daydreams private for now. In Silver Springs, the place where Powell was unfortunate enough to have lived since she was 4 years old, there wasn't much to do but daydream. In fact, she had become somewhat of a pro. Sometimes she pondered algae or other fuel experiments. Sometimes what kind of robot could best handle the unpredictable topography of Mars. Sometimes the latest rocket launch and where it was headed. But Pal's spaciness didn't discriminate. She'd also been caught drifting off her favorite graphic novel series, Double Chocolate Sundaes, and how unfair it was that her mom wouldn't let her get a dog. Spoiler alert, it really was unfair. The thought of dogs had her pondering the specifics of certain breeds again, and she was barely aware of Dante and Emma's banter beside her until it was too late. Earth to Pal, Dante said on her left, his hand inching dangerously close to a bag of milk duds, like he could tell she was silently breaking their no algae agreement. You might have better luck with Mars to Pal, Emma giggled on her right. Hal, did, Hal let today's green gloopy daydreams float away into the sherbet-colored sky and sat up to face her two friends, smiling in an I know I'm weird, but you love me anyway, right? Kind of way. What did I miss? She asked. Best superhero weapons, Emma said. We were debating Captain America's shield versus Thor's hammer. Ah, sorry, Pal said. But either way, you know I don't like weapons that defy physics. It's cheating. Emma smiled and shook her head, her freckles standing out against her pink cheeks, her hair sandy and glossy, hanging in two curtains on either side of her face. Beside her, Dante rolled his eyes and huffed, his black hair flopping into his eyes. He tossed it off his face with a flick of his head, a move he'd learned from the older boys on his soccer team, and Pa was feeling so magnanimous she didn't even tease him for doing it. Not everything has to be scientifically accurate, Pal, he said, making her regret her mercy. It's summer. Can we just forget about school stuff for like 3 seconds? We can't afford to. The polar ice caps are melting, Dante, Pal said witheringly. Coral reefs are dying by the acre. The ozone. Okay, I get it, he said. All science, no fun. He saluted, and Pal, feeling bad for being a stick in the mud, tossed a Cheeto at him and stuck out her tongue. It feels like it's always been the three of us, Pal thought as Dante ate the Cheeto, and then Emma began to try tossing Skittles into his mouth. But it had been Dante and Pal first, long before Emma moved into town 2 years ago. Dante had been Pal's neighbor since they were 4, when her dad, whom Pal barely remembered, had left for good, and her mom had been forced to move them into a rundown apartment complex at the edge of the desert. Aside from sporadic birthday cards from her father, never with money inside, and only sometimes on her actual birthday, it had been just Pal and her mom for the past 8 years. In the beginning, her mom tried to put up a brave front, but on several occasions, Pal had spied her crying out on the patio. One time, Dante's abuela heard the sobbing, and she immediately insisted on having Pal and her mom over for dinner that night, and then the next night, and the next. Every evening for weeks, Senora Mata had made rib-sticking feasts, while Dante and Pal eyed each other warily across the shag-carpeted living room. And then came the day when, as the kitchen filled with the smell of arroz con pollo, Dante held out a die-cast metal spaceship for Paolo to play with, keeping the astronaut action figure for himself. The shag carpet had turned into the terrain of an alien planet, and they'd been inseparable ever since. Well, at least until the beginning of 6th grade, when Dante had joined the soccer team and started putting gel in his hair. All this past year, he'd felt half in, half out to Pal, like he was always thinking about being somewhere else when they were together. Pal had been grateful for the end of soccer and school, and with the start of summer, the return of the Dante she'd always known. But she couldn't help worry about what 7th grade would bring for the three of them. It's getting late, Pal said, cutting off her own space out for once and shifting gears, picking up the candy wrappers and chip bags. She was, probably unsurprisingly, a stickler about litter. When you had researched the effect of trash on the world's bodies of water, it felt criminal to leave plastic behind. Dante grabbed the last empty M&M's bag as the sun began to sink in the sky, signaling the approach of the when the streetlights come on curfew they'd all been given. Hand him over, he said to Pal. I'll go to the trash can. Pal could see it in silhouette up near the graffitied sign that marked the beginning of the river hiking trail. The city rarely emptied the can, but using it was better than littering. Hurry, Emma said, and Dante saluted again. They were always careful to get back home on time. No one wanted their parents to come looking for them because they'd have to explain where they'd been. They'd all been expressly prohibited from going anywhere near the river after Marissa Martinez had drowned last year, sending all the middle school parents into a panic. Al was deeply offended by the restriction. She was a scientist. She knew about cold pockets in rivers and that could cause hypothermia even when the air temperature was shattering thermometers and currents could grab you in water 6 inches deep and other invisible traps and hazards beneath the surface that were a one-way ticket to drowning. Not that she was afraid of the water or anything, not at all. And even if she was understandably wary of it, there was no way she would admit to her mom because Pal had already heard more than enough lectures in her young life about the dumbest reason ever to be afraid of anything, a ghost. That's right. Pal's mom had forbidden her from going anywhere near the Hia years ago, when before any of the other parents had reacted to Marissa's tragic accident. The reason Pal had missed out on birthday parties, riverside barbecues, and anything else water related had a different name, La Llorena, or the Weeping Woman, the spirit of a mother who, according to a centuries old legend, had murdered her own children and who had supposedly super active in this region. And no, her mom's belief in the story was not a joke or an exaggeration, just a complete and total embarrassment. La Llorena is the most terrifying of all our ghosts, her mom would say. She drowned her children in a fit of rage and was cursed to wander the riverbank forever, calling their names, looking for her next young victim. Her mom was a gifted storyteller. Pal didn't like to admit it, but back when she was 8 years old, the stories had given her nightmares. Nightmares she had erased with good old fashioned research. The ghosts and wailing and disembodied hands had been replaced with sneaky currents, hypothermia, sunken tree branches that could snag an ankle. Those things were legitimately scary. But ghosts? There was no scientific basis for them. No evidence at all that their existence was even possible, let alone likely. An old folktale was definitely not a valid reason to change one's plans, especially when the plans happened to be the first boy girl river tubing party one had ever been invited to. Not that Pal was still bitter about that or anything. Dante took off for the trash can, but not before stuffing the last half of the Snickers in his mouth, his cheeks bulging around it. Gross, Dante, Emma said as he jogged toward the trailhead. She turned to pull one of Pal's shoulder length braids. They hadn't talked about it, but Pal wondered if Emma was as glad as she was to have the old Dante back. Seriously, though, Emma said to Pal, you're extra out here today. What are we obsessing about? Her blue eyes were bright and curious, like she was brainstorming a list of topics for a group project at school. The potential habitability of Europa, she guessed first, or why don't we make a whole sleeve of pink starbursts? Or, oh, is the dog thing again? What's this week's breed? Pal smiled back, grateful that her mom's fixation on all things supernatural hadn't made the list. Emma Lockwood was more interested in comics and the solar system, and she liked cats more than dogs. The horror! But she was the kind of person who took the time to learn about what you loved. She cared about what you cared about. Pal had moved on from thinking about Europa months ago, but she didn't mind the question. And she knew she was lucky to have a friend like Emma. Plus, seriously, why didn't they make a whole sleeve of pink starbursts? They were by far the best flavor. Even though Emma's family lived on the golf course side of town, far from the sagging roofs and peeling walls of Dante and Pal's apartment complex, their twosome had effortlessly become a threesome the day Emma had pulled out her America Chavez comic in homeroom. I'm not allowed to talk about today's obsession anymore, Pal said under her breath with a resigned look at Dante, who had just reached the can and was tossing their junk food trash into it. Oh, right, Emma whispered, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. Dante doesn't like algae. Pal giggled, but Emma wasn't done. As Dante turned to make his way back, Emma pulled Pal to the river's edge and scooped up a handful of the forbidden green stuff. That was another thing Pal loved about Emma. Even with her sparkly purple nail polish, she went for manicures with her mom every 2 weeks. She was still willing to get her hands messy for the sake of a good prank. Pal scooped a satisfying blob of algae for herself as Emma hid behind the scrub bushes near their blanket. Pal was just about to follow when a splash at the center of the river drew her eye. It had been too large to be one of the fish that would leap up for a water strider, but strangely, the surface of the river was now still. No ripples. You didn't even have to be a scientist to know that ripples formed in water at any point of disturbance. Had Pal's ghost ruminations caused her imagination kick into overdrive? Goosebumps erupted across her arms. All right, so that was chapter one. I hope that you enjoyed not only chapter one, but my review and plan to read it when it comes out this summer. And we'll see you next time on chapter one Read Aloud.